I just want to introduce our keynote speaker, our final keynote, who is David M. Walker, former United States Comptroller General. Dave is a nationally and internationally recognized expert on fiscal responsibility, government transformation and accountability, human capital, and retirement security. He has over 40 years of executive level experience in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, including heading 3 federal agencies, 2 nonprofits, a global service line for Arthur Andersen, and serving as Comptroller General of the United States and CEO of the U.S. Government Accountability Office for almost 10 years. We're really pleased to have David with us today, and I'm looking forward to hearing his presentation and his comments. David, come on up.
Good to be with you, Michelle. Thank you for the opportunity, and I appreciate your help in running the slides today. So why don't we start? Let's go ahead into the first slide. Next one, thank you. Whoa, here we go. There's a lot of numbers that you have to look at with regard to the federal government. You know, people talk about debt held by the public, the total debt subject to the debt ceiling, but those numbers are just a small fraction of where we're really at. The real number is total liabilities and unfunded obligations at the end of 2024, which are the latest financial statements, were almost $125 trillion. In addition to that, mandatory spending is now about 74% of the entire budget. In other words, we've written a blank check for 74% of annual spending by the federal government. I mean, how do you call that a budget when you've written a blank check for 74% of spending? Next, Michelle. Next slide. A couple of slides didn't show. Let me tell you what they said. In 1912, the federal government was about 2.5% of the economy. In 2024, the federal government's about 24% of the economy. Therefore, the federal government is about 10 times bigger than it was in 1912. In 1912, the federal government controlled 97% of annual spending. The only thing that it didn't control was interest. But in 2024, the federal government only controlled about 24% of spending. So the bottom line is the government's grown dramatically. It's promised too much. It's subsidized too many. It's lost control of the budget. It's undercut states' rights. And it's got to restructure its finances in order to avoid a debt crisis and create a better future. Both fiscal policy, which is tax and spending, is unsustainable, and monetary policy is unsustainable as well. So we've got to have better planning, transparency, and accountability. We've got to move to more of a results orientation. We've got to have more citizen education engagement in order to achieve these transformational changes. And if we don't, there are going to be severe adverse consequences for the United States, both domestically and internationally. And those adverse consequences will not just be felt domestically, they'll be felt around the world because of the significance the United States has to the global economy. And unfortunately, the Congress has consistently failed to act. Both parties are not responsible from a fiscal standpoint. The Republicans like to give tax cuts. The Democrats like to give spending increases. The combination of the two is hemorrhaging the bottom line. And I hate to say it, but it's true. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act may help to promote additional economic growth in the short term, but it exacerbates our longer range fiscal challenge. And I'll come back to that. Next, please. The numbers we deal with, trillions of dollars, most Americans have no idea what $1 trillion is. So here's what I've tried to do here is I've tried to create, an example that if Uncle Sam was a real person, based upon the audited financial statements for 9/30/24, which is the fiscal year ending for the federal government, September 30, what would numbers look like for an individual? And all I did here was I took the numbers from the financial statements and I dropped a bunch of zeros. So the annual income for Uncle Sam would be 50,000. Uncle Sam would have spent 74, so he had a deficit of 24,000 in 1 year. He would have current debt of 280,000. He'd have other liabilities of 180,000. So total liabilities of, 460,000. But then he'd have a bunch of unfunded obligations. In the case of the federal government, it deals with Social Security and Medicare and other social insurance programs. So Uncle Sam would have total liabilities and unfunded obligations of 1,240,000, and he only has assets of $57,000. So his net worth is 1,183,000 negative, big time bankrupt. Most Americans just can't understand these big numbers, and it's important to be able to convert them to something that they can understand. And hopefully this will help do it. Next slide, please. I believe that there are certain fiscal metrics that are the most important: debt to GDP, revenue to GDP, spending to GDP, interest to GDP, a variety of other metrics. You don't look at nominal dollars. You have to compare it to something that's relevant. And that relevant comparison, in my mind, is GDP. And if you look at debt to GDP, and I could go all the way back to the beginning of the Republic in 1789, the only time that we've been, in excess of 40% of debt to GDP until recently was World War II. But in World War II, we were betting the ranch. We saved the free world. We avoided attack on our homeland. And after World War II, we ended up regaining fiscal responsibility. We invested in human capital. We invested in critical infrastructure. We grew the economy much faster than the debt, even though we didn't pay down the debt. We just grew the economy faster than the debt. And therefore, debt to GDP went from over 100% to down, around 35 to 40%. And that's fine. That's a fine level. We lost control a little bit. We regained control. But since 2003, things have been out of control. But the problem is not where we've been, not where we are, it's where we're headed. And debt to GDP now is about 100% of GDP if you talk about just debt held by the public. It's about 125% if you talk about total debt subject to the debt ceiling, and it's going up even after the OBBBA. Next, please. Well, let's look longer range with regard to the Congressional Budget Office, and you can see that there's a gap between spending and revenues. And again, these are as a percentage of GDP, which is what I think the right metric is, not nominal dollars. And you can see we have a gap, and that gap is growing. The bottom line is this was based upon before the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. And the truth is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act did reduce spending somewhat from the projection, but it reduced revenue more than it reduced spending as compared to the projection. The bottom line is we're taxing at below average levels post World War II. We're spending at above average levels post World War II, and the gap is growing. Next slide, please. Oh, and here's the shocker. What's the second biggest expense in the federal budget? Interest. And what do you get for interest? Nothing. And what's the fastest growing expense of the federal? It's the second biggest. And what's the fastest growing? Interest. Here you can see the projected deficits, and a vast majority of the deficit has to do with interest because we're adding debt at record rates and interest rates are higher. And therefore we have a compounding effect. And what a lot of people don't understand is, you think about the deficit for the year. The deficit for the year may be close to $2 trillion. Okay, that's a lot of money. But we don't just have to refinance the deficit or finance the deficit. We have to refinance the amount of debt that is maturing in the given year. So therefore, in the next year, we're going to have to refinance 9 to 10 trillion dollars. Okay, and to the extent that we have to refinance that debt at higher rates, it's going to be the compounding effect of having more debt at higher interest rates, and that's what causes the situation to spend out of control. Next, please. And here you can see that, our biggest challenge is interest. And as I said, what do you get for interest? Nothing. Social Security is a challenge, but frankly, it's not difficult to solve. We can get into that in Q&A if you want to. Discretionary spending is expected to decrease. So the biggest problems are interest and healthcare programs. We've way overpromised on healthcare. We spend 19% of our economy on healthcare. We get below average results. Something's wrong. Next, please. And what about the One Big Beautiful Bill Act? Well, if you look at current law, which assumed that all the 2017 tax cuts were going to expire, you can see what that number is. It's the lowest line. If you look at the House passed bill, the Senate passed bill, you can see the Senate bill was worse than the House bill. That's what passed. And then if you assume that some of the temporary provisions in the Senate bill become permanent, which unfortunately tends to be the case, you can see it's even worse than that. So the bottom line is the One Big Beautiful Bill Act did have a lot of spending cuts in it, but it had a lot more loss of revenue through extension of the tax cuts than it had spending cuts. In addition to that, you have a situation where debt to GDP is expected to go up higher. Now, the administration will argue, well, you're not adequately considering the impact of tariffs. It's difficult for CBO to do that when you don't know what the tariffs are going to be. But the bottom line is that if you assume a reasonable tariff level after all these negotiations, it's 300 to 600 billion a year. That's real money, but if you run at a $2 trillion deficit, it doesn't come close to closing the gap. In addition, the real question is what impact does it have on inflation? Next slide, please. So the bottom line is let's assume that we don't don't act and we just continue to go and kick the can down the road, as Congress is very adept at, both political parties. So what are we going to get? We're going to get slower economic growth. We're going to get less individual opportunity. We're going to get a growing economic divide, less national security, lower international standing, less domestic tranquility. Over time, higher inflation and interest rates, higher unemployment, loss of confidence and decline in our market share for global reserve currencies for the dollar, dramatic stock and bond market decline at some point in time in the future if we have a debt crisis, likely global depression, and loss of superpower status. I would respectfully suggest we don't want these things. But let me tell you what I'm concerned about. What I'm concerned about is within the last 6 months, I've seen a significant increase in the number of elected officials and prominent business and other leaders who believe that Congress may not ever act until we have a debt crisis. That would be irresponsible, unethical, immoral, totally unacceptable. But I'm hearing more people say that. So as a result, I'm working on what needs to be done under Plan A to avoid a debt crisis. At the same point in time, if we have a debt crisis, which I hope and pray that we can avoid, then what needs to be done if we have a debt crisis? So Plan A, Plan B, I'm working on both. Let's keep moving. Next slide, please. So what's a four-pronged approach to addressing fiscal sanity and sustainability? Well, first we got to get the patient in shape. I'm using some healthcare terms here. We don't have a strategic plan for the federal government, even though there's a law that says we're supposed to have one. We don't have key national outcome-based indicators to say what are we trying to accomplish with regard to economics, national security, domestic tranquility, etc. You know, we need those two things. And after we get those two things, we can then look at how do we right size government? How do we adopt modern management practices? How do we improve transparency and accountability? And clearly, XBRL is a big part of that, okay? Doge was a tactical rather than a strategic approach to looking at government. I mean, it was doing a tactical and transactional review of information systems, looking for possible examples of fraud, waste, abuse, or mismanagement. It wasn't doing a strategic and transformational review of what the government does, how the government does business, what's it trying to accomplish, how does it measure success. That's what we need. That's where the real big bucks are, which can help you determine what should be devolved to the states, what should be consolidated, what should be eliminated, what should be enhanced, if you will, cut and enhanced, okay? We need to stabilize the patient. We need to have a statutory fiscal sustainability commission. that will engage the American people with the facts, the truth, the tough choices, where everything is on the table, but not everything is equal, that will set the table for a tough vote in Congress, that will, A, assure the solvency and sustainability of Social Security as one package of reforms standing alone, and secondly, will ensure that we can get down to a reasonable level of debt to GDP over the next 10 or so years. I'd say 90%. We're already at 100, and we're headed up. We need to get down to 90 and make sure that it's stabilized at that level. So we need that. Thirdly, we need to cure the disease. You know, the only thing that can bind current and future Congresses to be fiscal sane and provide stability in the future is a constitutional amendment. A constitutional amendment that, among other things, could limit how much debt as a percentage of the economy we take on, absent very limited, unexpected, and extraordinary circumstances. And there is a resolution in the House that provides visibility on this. We can get into more of that on Q&A if you want to. And then we need to prepare for a medical emergency. If Congress fails to act, which quite frankly they're good at doing, and continue to kick the can down the road, then we need to come up with a plan for what are we going to do when we have a debt crisis. And in some cases, it'll be doing the things that we should have done to avoid a debt crisis. But you know how they say, never let a crisis go to waste. And therefore, we need to be prepared and be able to have a package of reforms that can be moved very expeditiously in order to restore confidence in the ability of the federal government to manage its finances. Otherwise, we would have a global depression. Next, please. So, what about financial reporting changes? You know, we've made a lot of progress on financial reporting at the federal level since 2000. I was Comptroller General from 1998 to 2008. We made a lot of changes during that period of time, and they were positive, but we still have more that we need to make. We need to show our intergovernmental debt obligations as a liability on the balance sheet. We need to show interest on a gross basis rather than net basis. Why? Because of the 14th Amendment. There are only two things guaranteed by the Constitution from a financial standpoint: Union Civil War pensions, and we've met that obligation, and Treasury debt. And the debt that's held by the intergovernmental debt that's held by the trust funds is guaranteed as to the full faith and credit of the United States government, both as to principal and interest and by the 14th Amendment. We should be showing that gross, not net. And by the way, when you show interest gross, our situation's even worse than it is right now. Politicians like to talk about the lowest numbers when they're bad and the highest numbers when they're good. I guess that's human nature, but that's not a full and fair view of where we're at. Secondly, we need a double bottom line on the balance sheet. We need the current bottom line adjusted for the changes that I mentioned above with regard to liabilities. And then we need to have a second bottom line that shows the huge unfunded social insurance obligations, because the unfunded social insurance obligations are double what the total debt held by the public is. We need to enhance intergenerational financial burden reporting. I mean, we're mortgaging the future of our children, grandchildren, and the unborn at record rates. That's irresponsible, it's unethical, it's immoral. We have some transparency on that now, but we need more transparency. We should eliminate weapon systems and munitions from the balance sheet. We have no intention to sell those. At the same point in time, we need to increase disclosures with regard to those items. We need to have additional disclosures with regard to federal property, both land as well as other properties. And we need to provide additional disclosures with regard to tax preferences. We lose $1.8 trillion a year in deductions, exemptions, credits, and exclusions between corporate and individual. They're like writing a blank check for those as well. We need more transparency over there so we can provide more accountability and periodically review them and decide what ought to be continued, what ought to be eliminated, what ought to be revised. That's really backdoor spending. Next slide, please. And what about audit and other data changes? You know, the number of financial audits should be reduced. Candidly, the only thing the American people care about, in my view, is an audit on the consolidated financial statements of the U.S. government. You must do other audits in order to get to that point, and the biggest obstacle is the Department of Defense. In my view, the GAO ought to assume responsibility for the audit of the Department of Defense, with help from the Inspector General and outside independent auditors as well, given the size of it. Because that's the only reason we haven't been able to express an opinion on the financial statements is because DOD. It's a lag indicator and it's highly material, so it's got to be resolved before you can express an opinion. We need to have much greater emphasis on performance and compliance audits. People don't understand the difference. I mean, what a financial audit is and what it isn't. I mean, it doesn't, it says these are what the numbers are, fairly presented in all material respects. It doesn't give you an obligation to do anything about fraud unless it's material to the financial statements. And in addition to that, it does nothing with regard to economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. That's what people care more about. They care more about performance and compliance with regard to individual departments and agencies. There ought to be more agreed upon procedures reviews for internal controls, data adequacy and security, programs and references. As I said, the GAO should assume responsibility for the DoD audit. IGs are on the front line of fighting fraud, waste, and abuse and mismanagement. They need to enhance their efforts there. And frankly, both the GAO and the IGs need to learn the lessons from Doge. I mean, Doge employed artificial intelligence to review transactions and information systems, and GAO and the IGs should learn from that. In particular, the IGs, because they're on the front line of fighting fraud, waste, abuse, and mismanagement. And then federal financial and performance information systems need to be modernized, integrated, and more accessible. And obviously, XBRL can play a big, big role with regard to that. We need more transparency to facilitate better accountability. I hate to say it, but the current the current OMB doesn't seem to be in line with this, and they need to change course and get more in line with this because they're not wanting to provide transparency with regard to congressional appropriated funds. And there's an increasing tension between OMB and GAO with regard to impoundments and rescission matters. Hopefully that'll get resolved, but it's very real right now. Next, please. So in closing, the most important words in the Constitution of the United States are the first three. We the people. We the people are responsible and accountable for what does or does not happen in Washington. Our collective future is at risk. If you can't put your finances in order, you won't maintain economic strength over time, and it threatens our superpower status as well as the future of our country, our businesses, our families, the time for action is sooner versus later. And here's some websites you can go to for some more information. Last slide. Here's my latest book. You can find out more about it at American2040.com. I mean, the truth is, I've done 4 books. This is probably the best, but I self-published it because I'm not looking to make money on it. I'm just looking to impart knowledge. And as a result, while it may be the best book, it'll never achieve a national bestseller status like my last book, which was American 2040. So why don't I leave it at that? I'm happy to take any questions you may have. Thanks for the opportunity. Let me just leave it with this. We live in a great country, probably the greatest in the history of mankind, but we've got some serious challenges that we need to start confronting, the biggest of which is putting our finances in order. We need to do it sooner rather than later before we have a debt crisis, because that's not something that anybody should ever want. Thank you.
Dave, thank you so much, and apologies for the barking dog in the background. Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we do have some questions that we'd like to take.
Sure.
All right. So that was a rousing speech and very exciting. Lots going on. The first question is about Social Security fixes. And the person asking the question said, I believe it will take a multi-pronged approach. What are the Social Security fixes? And how can they be implemented?
Well, in 2012, I did a 10,000-mile, 27-state national fiscal responsibility bus tour that was financed largely by H. Ross Perot Sr. May God rest his soul.
Mhm.
And in that, I asked the American people, what do you think needs to be done with regard to reforming a number of programs, including Social Security? And here's basically what they said. They said, we want to keep a base defined benefit system that is solvent, sustainable, secure, that provides reasonable protection against poverty, in old age, that's indexed to inflation. Uh, at the same point in time, we need to have additional savings. We need to get our savings rate up. And so what they talked about was, all right, let's gradually increase the normal retirement age further from 67 to 69 for people that, let's say, are 55 or under 55, okay? And let's increase the taxable wage base cap roughly double what it is right now. Let's change the benefit formula to provide a higher replacement rate for people near the poverty level and a lower replacement rate for upper middle and upper income individuals. Let's change the indexing formula for cost of living to be able to better reflect cost of living for seniors, which is very different than it is for the overall population. And then let's also add a supplemental individual savings account on top, an automatic savings account on top, mirrored after the Federal Thrift Savings Program for individuals who don't otherwise have access to an employer-sponsored 401k or retirement plan, if you will. That got 77% support. And I might note that that's way more than you need to override a veto.
Okay, great. And I'm going to jump around the questions here a little bit because I got another one about Social Security. Do you have any idea how much of the Social Security funds are being lent to the general fund? Is the interest able to pay the benefits? And if so, when will interest not be enough?
Well, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act
Mhm.
uh, did two things with regard to Social Security. One, it accelerated the date of exhaustion of the trust fund from 2033 to 2032, and it increased the amount of benefits that will have the percentage of benefits that would have to be cut once the trust fund is exhausted from 21% to 24%. So, stated differently, if we do nothing, we can pay full Social Security promise benefits until 2032, the end of 2032. But if we don't reform the program, everybody at every income level will get a 24% cut in their benefits across the board. That's stupid. It's irresponsible,
Mhm.
and we ought to reform it sooner rather than later. My frustration with regard to politicians is we have an opportunity to reform Social Security to exceed the expectation of every generation of Americans. And why do I say that? Because seniors think they're going to get taken advantage of. There are other words I could use, but I won't. And secondly, young people don't think they're going to get it. They're both wrong. So we have an opportunity to reform this program, phase in the changes. Everybody gets more than they think they're going to get. I call that a win. But the biggest problem we have is the biggest deficit in Washington, D.C. on this issue is a leadership deficit. We don't have anybody who has the courage to lead on this issue in elective office. And hopefully that's going to change, and I'm trying to change it.
Great. Okay. The next question, I think we just have time for like two more questions. I know we're running late. I hope that's okay. Is that okay?
Yeah, no problem. Go right ahead.
Okay. All right. When Warren Buffett talks at his stockholders meeting, his first discussion is the company's financial report and overall financial condition. But when the president gives the State of the Union, why doesn't he talk about the financial state of the union, including the financial report of the US government and numbers that you're talking about? You may know who this is
Well,
coming from.
politicians like to talk about good news. They don't
Mhm.
like to talk about bad news, okay? And there is legislation in Congress and has been for a while that would require the Comptroller General of the United States, the position that I had, CEO of the Government Accountability Office, to give an annual report to the Congress on the state of U.S. finances. The bottom line is most people don't understand these numbers, and I and others are working to try to help fill that gap. Steve Ballmer, who's one of the original founders of Microsoft, has formed USA Facts. I'm in conversations with his organization right now to figure out how we can end up more effectively communicating that information to the American people. He publishes each year something comparable to a 10K for government. Unfortunately, most people in America don't read right now, much less read a 10K. And so therefore, I think there's more progress that's necessary here. And one of the reasons I think we need a statutory fiscal commission is we need to be able to go to the American people with the facts and the truth and the tough choices and solicit their input. And part of that is help them understand the true situation as to where we are, where we're headed, how we compare to others, and what would happen if we fail to act.
Great. Okay, last question. How do we get government officials to focus on investment in efficiency and effectiveness?
Well, investment has different meanings. I think of investment as something that could generate a positive rate of return. In the case of government, it's spending money or giving a tax preference, whether or not it's going to generate a positive rate of return. Okay? My personal view is that we need a number of different reforms, including budget reforms. And one of the budget reforms we need is we need to have an operating budget and we need to have a capital budget, which would be an investment budget. Okay? We ought to try to seek to balance the operating budget, and we ought to try to seek to make sure that the capital budget are for things that are investments in the future that hopefully will generate a positive rate of return over time, but we don't want to count that against the deficit in the current year. And then in addition to that, we also need to be able to make sure that we're focusing on the metric that really matters the most, and that is how much debt do we have as a percentage of the economy? Because not all debt is bad. We don't need to be debt free. We're never going to be debt free in the future, nor do we need to be. But we can't have too much debt as a percentage of the economy because that ends up slowing economic growth, squeezing out capital for the private sector, which is the engine of growth and innovation, increasing interest costs for which we get nothing. And so I think, we need to be more thoughtful with regard to how we're approaching the difference between investments and consumption. We have not enough investments and too much consumption. That's the bottom line.
Okay, great. All right, well, I think we're going to close. I really appreciate you sticking around a little bit late here, Dave,
No
and
problem.
been a great presentation. Really eye-opening, a little scary, but really a great way to end our conference, and gives us a lot to think about going forward. So
Thanks,
thank you very
Michelle.
much.
Good to be with you. All the best.